country Somerset was the Duke of Beaufort's. Going down Turner Street here, coming up to Front Street, the business district of Beaufort. Goes for about 2 miles both directions. They just repaved Turner Street, thank goodness. It's the only paved street in Beaufort right now with all the construction.
Wow, seriously?
You have to remind me of a low branch is about to whack me in the back of the head. You just go like this, okay? We used to stand up to do the tours, and we learned our lesson. This is Front Street. It wasn't always this paved sidewalk street. It used to be nothing but water. It was actually called Water Street originally. It was nothing but sand and shells. It's a little better now, although the water does occasionally come up this high in storms, as you can imagine. I mean, so it goes to the inlet. Inlet's only about 1.5 miles off to the Atlantic Ocean. Coming up on your right is the North Carolina Maritime Museum. In there they have a number of exhibits on the fishing industry, of course, and life-saving techniques of the ocean. They also have an entire whale skeleton hanging on the ceiling. They found a whale out in Shackleford Banks a few years ago, and they thought they'd be clever and bury the whale in the sand and let the critters eat all the flesh so they'd have a skeleton. What they didn't know was that those critters ate everything, including the connective tissue between the bones. So when they went back and dug it up, all they had was a massive pile of sperm whale bones. Took them 4 years to reassemble it, but they did, and it's hanging on the ceiling. Also in there, there's an exhibit on a man named Edward Teach. Edward Teach, you don't know him as Edward Teach. You know him as Blackbeard, the pirate, the most famous pirate of all. He only existed for about 2 years, but boy, what a name he made. And about 17 or so, 16, he sank his ship out in the inlet about 1.5 miles off in about 40 feet of water. It was called the Queen Anne's Revenge. He had stolen it from the French and named it the Queen Anne's Revenge. He was in love with Queen Anne, apparently. That's what they say. They say he sank it deliberately because he didn't want to pay his crew. Well,
that's one way to do it.
It took us about 300 years before we found the ship down there in 40 feet of water. What was left of it, a lot of metal and gold and things like that. They've been bringing it up pieces ever since. They've taken them up to the historical centers of the universities up north, and they restore the pieces, and there's a number of exhibits in there on Queen Anne's Revenge. On the left side is the Watercraft Center, where they build and restore wooden boats. You're welcome to go in there on a little balcony and watch them work. Because of the age of our town, a number of our buildings said to be haunted. This one on the right here, occasionally a little girl appears in that upper right window, even when it's not occupied. We said that one day on a tour, and a little girl popped up in that window. Much to the surprise of all of us, we thought about hiring a little girl just to appear there for a bus tour.
That would be awesome.
I know, thank you. Coming up on your far right corner, that's Colonel Easton's house. Colonel Easton was the highest ranking member from Beaufort to serve in the Revolutionary War. But more importantly, Jacob Henry lived here in the early 1800s. Jacob Henry was a member of the North Carolina legislature. The other members wanted to kick him out, though. He refused to put his right hand on the Bible. Why? He was Jewish. So they wanted to kick him out. In 1808, he got up and delivered this impassioned speech about religious tolerance. I guess he was so good and so compelling, they allowed him to stay. That is Jacob Henry, 1808. To this day, we still have somewhat religious tolerance in our government. These homes along the front street are built by merchants, sea merchants, and sea captains. That's why the architecture varies so much. We're going up to the Slough House. My normal run isn't Wednesday. I'm subbing for somebody. So Keith doesn't know my pattern. Here, stop for a second, Keith. Thank you, buddy. The Slough House, S-L-O-O. Captain Slough came over from England on a sailing ship. He was a sea captain, and with his wife and his young baby girl. Well, that little girl grew up here in that house, and she started hearing stories about her relatives in England. And she said, "Daddy, I want to go visit the relatives in England." Daddy said, "I'll take her. I'll take you." Mommy, being a good mother, said, "No, you're not. You're not taking our little girl across the Atlantic Ocean in a rickety old sailing ship." Well, the little girl never stopped begging and pleading, as kids can do, as you know. Well, finally, the mother relented and said, "Yes, you can take her, but you promise to bring her back." Captain Slough said, "I promise to bring her home." We'll continue that story in a little while because I love building suspense. And I
That's
over
why
there
you're
to the
called
left.
Hollywood.
That is Piper's Island, named for Peter Piper. He was a French Huguenot. On the right side of Piper's Island is the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as long as their budget lasts.
Oh, that's
Built in
where
the early
that is.
1900s. On the left where the gray ship is, that is Duke Marine Laboratory. You may have heard of the University Duke. That is Duke Marine. Rachel Carson worked there in the 40s. She wrote a few books about pesticides and dangers. Mrs. Davis was an entrepreneur, and she wanted to build a boarding house, so she bought 3 houses right there to your right, combined them under one roof. You could stay there all day, 3 meals a day, and a bed, and a little bathhouse across the street, all for $1 a day. 1800s. She's no longer in business. I guess she didn't charge enough money. Coming up to the end of the street, kind of a sad story. This is Gallant's Channel where it meets Taylor's Creek. Last house on your right, unfortunately, we've always talked about it, it burned down in December.
Ah,
It was the Duncan house. It was a chandlery, a ship store. Mr. Duncan ran the ship store, and the ships, big ships would anchor off and bring in their longboats for supply for Mr. Duncan. And they say he never missed a sail. Even when the water was roaring through here, went up through his front door, he just opened the back door, let the water run through, never missed a sail. They're rebuilding it, probably in the original footprint and the original design. 1920s, the house was owned by a man named Billy Blades. Sounds like a hockey player to me, Billy Blades. But his best friend used to come down and fish and hunt with him. Well, there's a picture of his best friend sitting on the front porch with a shotgun and fishing pole. His best friend, Mr. Babe Ruth.
hey.
Porch, there's a picture of him sitting there. He'd bring in his pleasure boat, big pleasure boat, and to fish and hunt.
That's pretty
This
cool.
is our new high-rise bridge straight ahead. Built in 2018. It replaced our drawbridge, a quaint little drawbridge, unless you were waiting when they raised it for a boat or a ship, and it took forever. I was in New Bern on Monday, and the first time ever, the drawbridge went up. It's the slowest bridge. I had to shave twice while I was waiting. That's how long it took. I kid you not. Now keep in mind, 90% of what I say is 90% true. So you do the math, okay? I don't make anything. A little bit. So this is Taylor's Creek meeting Gallant's Channel. Straight out there. It's gonna be a hard one to see because of the sun today. Out where the grass and bushes are pretty tall out there. As far as you can see, there's a tall flagpole. That's good right here, Keith, for just a minute. That flag sits atop Fort Macon, M-A-C-O-N. It's a third fort out there.
wow.
The first 2 washed away in storms, so when they started building this in the 1820s, they wanted it to last. So they hired a young lieutenant engineer out of West Point to advise them. He said, what you need are jetties, stone jetties coming off the coast, and that will break your storms. Well, that fort is still there today. That young man's name, Mr. Robert E. Lee, became the commander of the forces of the South. Well, in 1861, the Civil War broke out, war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on where you're from. There was a young man in town, Josiah Pender. He owned a hotel here at Beaufort called the Atlantic Hotel, the finest hotel in all of the Atlantic coast in the 1800s. Right here in Beaufort on the water, and he didn't want those Yankees taking his hotel. So he and 50 of his friends rowed out in rowboats with guns and took the fort for the South. It wasn't a big take. There was only a fort keeper and his wife, and they gladly gave it up to them. They held it for 1 whole year until the North came down with a man named Ambrose Burnside. He was a big barrel of a man. They say he was a great leader, but he knew something about the fort. All the cannons were bolted down and cemented. They couldn't be turned around. They were facing the ocean. So Burnside came in from the west along both banks and shelled them for 3 days. Not with cannonballs. He didn't want to destroy the fort. They needed it. They shelled it with bolts, big iron bolts. Well, 3 days later, the Southerners, about 100 by then, gave up. They promised neutrality, and they were never punished for taking that fort. That is Fort Macon. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's a magnificent structure. And a good tour out there. At the back down Front Street. taught school in Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, and Hollywood for 41 years, private school. And that's where the name Hollywood came from. When somebody found out, oh, Hollywood, huh? Boom, Hollywood. I don't mind it. The traffic was horrific in Hollywood. The worst traffic. It took me 2 hours on about a 25-mile drive. 2 hours one way, 2 hours back. Enough. 1 year of that school. There is no natural stone in Carteret County. You dig into this ground, you will find sand and shells. That is it. That's why you see most foundations of brick. Brick was a big business here in Carteret County. They manufactured the bricks from Fort Macon right here in Carteret County. This is the third run for this bus this summer because it's been in the shop most of the winter and all through the spring. Try to get parts for a 1967 English bus. Turning to Orange Street, named for William of Orange. He was on the throne before Queen Anne. If I have kids on the bus, I always say, that's William of Orange, and there was no William of Banana. If you look at the foundation on Colonel Easton's house, look at that. Round stones. Where in the heck did he get round stones? Well, in the old days when ships came in, they brought in light goods like cloth and spices. Well, the way those big ships down, they used ballast stones, the big round stones along with the ship. When they left, they took our goods, tar, lumber, heavy goods, so they had to get rid of their ballast stones. They just dumped them on the shore. A man like Mr. Easton got smart and got the ballast stone to build this foundation. Legend has it that that basement, that short basement, served as a temporary prison for Confederate soldiers. Coming up on your left is house with black shutters. I say black, but most of what look like black shutters in Beaufort are actually dark green as the custom color for shutters in Beaufort. This is the Hatzel house. It's not known for the Hatzels. Known for their niece, Emmeline Piggott. Emmeline Piggott was dating a soldier named Stokes McRae, a Confederate soldier. Stokes McRae, there's the name, I love it, Stokes. She said, Stokes, let's get married. Stokes said, you know what, this is a horrific war. Let's wait till after the war. I don't know what's going to happen. He didn't know. He went up to Pennsylvania and fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he was killed there, along with 50,000 other men in 3 days. That didn't sit well with Emmeline Piggott. She was here in Beaufort, and she started going back and forth. The Union Army took control of the town. They occupied this town, but the Confederate soldiers were in and out. She started going back and forth between the Confederate soldiers and Confederate camps. The Union Army got suspicious and had her searched. It took a long time to find a woman to search her. She had those big hoop skirts. Underneath that hoop skirt, they found letters from soldiers, Confederate soldiers, tobacco, notes, even a pair of combat boots. Well, they said, Emmeline Piggott, you're a spy. We're going to put you to death. They never did. She died of old age in Morehead City, and that's where she's buried. But if you ever go to Washington, D.C., there's a spy museum there. And Emmeline Piggott is featured there as the only Confederate female spy. That is Emmeline Piggott. We're going to turn left on Ann Street, named for Queen Anne. Queen Anne had an E on the end of Anne. The street doesn't. We don't know what happened to the E on Ann Street. It might have blown off in a hurricane. We don't know. There is a Queen Street named for her. Maybe they only had 2 E's to use, and they used it on Queen Street. This is Ann Street. She was so impressed that they named 2 streets for her in Beaufort. She sent money as a present to Beaufort. And with that money, they planted elm trees the entire length of Ann Street. They say in the heyday of the elm trees, you could not see the sun at noon because of the canopy of elm. But Dutch elm disease got most of them. There's a few still left. The old days in Beaufort, you were taxed by the number of stories you had in your house. They looked at it from the front of the house. Watch out the branches. Usually in the spring we take the bus out and the man with the chainsaw and we trim the, but we weren't able to do that, so be careful. So if you look at this house on the far right corner, you can see from the right side of the house it's 2 stories, black shutter, 2 stories. But if you look at it from the front, it looks like 1 story. I know you wouldn't try to cheat the tax man, but if you went in that house, stop here for just a second, Keith. in there, there's a ladder leading to a loft, and you sleep up in the loft, and if you're young enough in the morning, you jump down. It's not 2 stories, it's a story and a jump. So they only got that for the story. If you look down at the end, we're on an island. You have to cross water to get to Beaufort. Well, in the old days, there were no bridges, so they had a ferry that came in from Morehead City at the end of this road, Ann Street, and that's where he picked up the ferry at noon and 6. There were only 2 times it ran. By the way, in the old days, ships would go out, and the husband would say to the wife, I'll be back in 6 months, 4 months, a year, whatever it is. At the end of that time, the wife would get up to the rooftop and look for her husband's sails coming in. If you look to the left, that red roof over there, there's that little patio on top of the roof. It's hard to see through the trees. Because they didn't come back often, that is called a widow's walk. A widow's walk. My wife wants me to build a widow's walk on our house. I don't know if I should be suspicious or not.
A little bit.
Sorry, she doesn't like that, Chuck. I don't like it. She's ridden with me a number of times, and she advises me about what to say and what not to say. And being a good husband, I seldom listen, but that's just me. I don't know. He has to back up here. We used to go to the end of Ann Street, but they built some fancy new homes down there and put up a big brick wall. You can't turn around down there anymore. This third house on the right, I don't know if you can see it through the trees, it's a brown color. People say, Hollywood, why are all the houses in the old town white? Anybody know why it's white? All these houses were always white. That was the cheapest paint you could buy in the old days. You couldn't afford to put a tint in your paint. That is Peter Piver's house, was. They took, 2 architects bought it, and they took that house down to the bare original wood. And guess what color they found was the original color? That was it. So Peter Piver must have had a little money. Going back down Ann Street the other way. Coming up on your left is St. Paul's Episcopal Church, built in 1857. It was built, believe it or not, by ship captains. Can you tell? They only knew how to build one thing, so what they did, they didn't know anything about building a church. They built a ship upside down. You go in there and look at the wood structure in there, it looks exactly like the innards of a ship upside down. When it was opened in 1857, all the women of town donated their silver to the church, and they melted it down and made a silver chalice. And that's what they serve communion with to this day, that silver chalice. Like I said, the Union Army occupied Beaufort from 62 to 65. And it was a peaceful occupation. It sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't fit together. Peaceful occupation. Well, the Beaufortians weren't resistant. And it was a pretty easy town for the Union Army to control. This house on your left corner here, that was Mr. Leecraft's house. Mr. Leecraft was a very wealthy businessman. And they took his house to use. Right here for a second, Keith, thank you. They made it the Provost Marshal's office, and that's where they monitored people leaving Beaufort and coming in. If you left Beaufort, you had to tell the Union Army where you were going. When you came back, you had to check in with them and say what you were doing out there. Well, they weren't very kind to Mr. Leecraft's house, the Union Army. To keep their horses warm during the winter, they put the horses on the first floor. When they got cold, they chopped up his furniture with an axe and burned it in the fireplace. There are still axe marks on the floor in there. Now, I'm not commenting about the Union Army. My wife calls me a Yankee because I was born in Indiana. I don't know if that makes me a Yankee. She said, don't talk about the Union Army. No, I'm just telling you what they did to his house. Now, thanks, Keith. Now, if you're a rich man and you have 2 sons, Mr. Leecraft did have 2 sons, you better build them a house each, and they better be very similar. Coming up on your left is Leecraft's son number 1. And right next door is Leecraft's son number 2. Pretty similar, right? That's going for, I think, $3.2 million right now, if you're interested.
Nope.
There's an old tradition in the South where you paint the ceiling of your front porch light blue, called paint blue. Paint for the word pawns. Supposedly that light blue paint was to keep insects away and evil spirits. This brand new house over here to your right, look at the upper roof. Light blue, that's paint blue. I don't know if it keeps spirits away, but it did keep insects away because paint in those days had lye in it. And insects didn't like lye. But they found out lye wasn't safe for children, so they replaced the lye with something a lot safer, lead. Always a good choice. Okay, careful. I grew up in the 50s, 60s with lead paint, and I came out almost okay. Look at this heavy traffic, just like Los Angeles. I get impatient in Moorhead or Beaufort when I'm driving. My wife said, "Paul, do you remember Los Angeles?" This tall wooden structure coming up on your right, originally a Masonic Lodge, one of the first Masonic lodges, one of the tallest wooden buildings in Beaufort. It wasn't a lodge very long, but it became a girls' seminary in the 1800s, but not a religious seminary. It was a place where the girls could go to learn how to become proper mothers and wives. They say it's for sale, and it's going to become a boutique hotel. A city like Beaufort can't have too many boutique hotels, right? The old library on the right, and beyond the library is the Oddfellows Lodge. It was built by the same masons who built Fort Megan. They came in here at night and built it. The motto of the odd couple was truth, friendship, and love. The three rings above the front door symbolize truth, friendship, and love. They're turn right on Broad Street. It's the widest street in town because the railroad in 1906 came down this street right in the middle from Moorhead City. The first railroad. Only one track. They couldn't turn around, so they had to back out of town. They say the engineer on that train had a one-track mind. Sorry. 1906 courthouse. These oak trees have a history. They served as hanging trees until about 1925. People came from miles around for a good hanging. I don't care. I know how you feel about old Civil War statues, but I'm going to talk about one anyway. Coming up on your left is a 6'6" bronze statue. It commemorates the 40,000 men who lost their life from North Carolina, more than any other southern state. Do note that his back faces the north. One of the oldest wood churches in North Carolina. On your right, Purvis Chapel. Originally, it was a Methodist church that served the black community and the white community. The white congregation outgrew it. They moved down to the next corner and built a new church. They gave this to the black congregation. They still use it today. It is the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. They say the bell in the tower was made by the same foundry that made the Liberty Bell. Coming up on your right is the old burial ground. It's not a graveyard because it's not connected to any one of the four churches. To be a graveyard, it has to be a yard of the church. It's the burial ground. Over 500 graves going back to 1700. I'm going to talk about two of them. The first one I have to talk about is in October around Halloween. 8 of us bring 8 characters to life in full costume. Kind of eerie to see us at Halloween and not dead of night but dark. This is Otway Burns. Otway Burns with the cannon on top of it. He was born in 1775 in Swansboro, down the road, and he learned sailing and shipbuilding at a young age, as most boys did in those days. And in 1812, we were a young country, but England wasn't done with us, even though we had our independence. They were off the coast here, taking our ship, taking our men, and taking our goods, and we couldn't do a thing about it because we didn't have a navy. So the government, U.S. government, said, listen, if you have a ship with a cannon or two on it, we'll give you a letter of marque, which made you a legal pirate, basically, and you could go off and capture all the British ships and the goods you wanted to, legally. Otway Burns said, I like that idea. So he and his partner, they were in business, he had a number of business, they went up to New York and bought a ship, 80 feet long, 20 feet wide, and had 6 cannons on it. He called it, $4,000, by the way, 1811 or something, that's a lot of money. He named it the Snapdragon. He rounded up a crew, it had 100 people on it, rounded up a crew and sailed the coast from Nova Scotia to South America, back and forth, and Otway Burns was good. He captured over 40 British ships and confiscated almost $4 million worth of goods. They say at the end of the war, he may have been the richest man in North Carolina. Now, what do you do when you're a legal pirate and you have a lot of money? You go into politics. That wouldn't happen any day now, but he did it and served in the North Carolina legislature for 12 years. And while Otway Burns was there, he invested all that money he made. Well, Otway Burns was a great pirate, but he was a terrible businessman. He lost every penny of his money. 1835, he was voted out of office, a pauper. Andrew Jackson, the president, also a hero of the War of 1812, took pity on Otway Burns and made him a lighthouse keeper out near Ocracoke Island, and that's where he died in 1850. He was buried here with nothing more than a wooden marker as a poor pauper. In 1900, 5 of his grandsons decided their granddaddy deserved something better than a wooden marker. They had that granite obelisk erected, and they put that cannon on top of it. That cannon, my friend, is from his ship, the Snapdragon, one of them. 2 towns named for him, Otway out where I live, and Burnsville, western North Carolina. 2 ships named for him, World War I and World War II, the USS Burns. Next grave I'm going to talk about is a very low grave. It's going to be hard to see. Once Keith stopped, you may have to stand up to see it. It's the most requested grave in the old burial ground. I told you about the Slough girl. She went to England with her daddy. The story goes she had a good time visiting relatives. Well, on the way back in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, she caught a fever and died on the ship. Now, in those days, they had no way to preserve a body, embalm the body, but he had promised his wife and her mother he'd bring her back. So he got a big wooden barrel of rum, opened the barrel, put his daughter's body in it, sealed it up, and brought it here and buried it there. That sounds a little fishy, doesn't it? Well, the University of North Carolina came down and they x-rayed that ground all the way around, 12 feet down, and guess what they found? They found a number of rusty iron bands, circular bands in various diameters, which would be indicative of a barrel. That's the only evidence we have. All the toys on the grave come from local school children. They come by and put toys on the grave every day on them. We asked a little girl one time, why do you do that? She said, well, that way the little Slough girl has something to play with when she comes out at night. I do late day tours there, and sometimes dark tours with people. I steer clear of them. That is the Slough girl. Her parents aren't in the burial ground, as far as we know. They may have left town. Dr. Manning had this house on the left corner. Dr. Manning was a big supporter of education. Matter of fact, he started school for boys here in Beaufort. He wanted his daughter, oldest daughter, to have a good education, so he hired a tutor out of Boston named Charles French. Well, Charles French came down to tutor Nancy, and guess what? They fell in love. And Charles French said, Dr. Manning, can I marry your daughter Nancy? And he, being a good dad, said, no. Not until you make a name for yourself. So they promised to write to each other. And they did for every day for months. Well, what they didn't know was Dr. Manning was a friend of the postmaster here in Beaufort, and the postmaster held all the letters, so they never got a letter.
Aww.
Well, I'm going to finish that story later because, as you know, I like to build suspense. This house on your left is blue and gray, or gray, I guess. It's a Victorian home. We don't have many Victorian. Victorian, you have to have symmetry. You have to have a door above a door, a window next to a window above a window. What happens if that doesn't quite come out right for the symmetry? Look at the right side of the house. You fake it. I kid you not. Now you have symmetry. I kid you not. This house is said to be haunted. When I first started doing tours, a work crew was here. 15 different workmen. They're working on that house. One day they just disappeared. Never came back. We're hoping they're not in the house. We're turning right on Live Oak Street. No, I'm sorry, Queen. Is this Queen? Yeah, this is Queen. Yeah, this is the bumpiest street in all of Beaufort. They made it bumpier recently with the construction. We used to stand up, like I said, on the bus. You had to sit down on Queen Street. I think a fancy town like Beaufort would have something nicer. Thank you, Keith, for catching that. House on your left, the Rumley House. It says 1843, but it's not 1843. It was built in the 1700s out on Shackleford Banks. But all the houses out there washed away in storm. In 1843, they decided to move that on a barge over here and put it down. The next house on your left is the only house that has two plaques on it. The Allen Davis House, 1774, and Ambrose Burnside, that Union General stayed here when he commanded the troops here in Beaufort. He was known for something, Ambrose Burnside. He had those big mutton chop hair things on the side of his face. Guess what word we get from Ambrose Burnside? Sideburns. That's where the word sideburns come. Ambrose Burnside. A couple good restaurants, Blue Moon Bistro, Beaufort Grocery. No, I don't own any part of it, so I mentioned them. We're coming up on Taylor's Creek. It wasn't always this deep. Years ago, you could walk across it at low tide, but they have dredged it over the years and brought up sand and mud, and that's how they made Front Street over in this section. They also covered the 6 islands out there. There used to be 6 individual islands, but they've covered it with sand and mud. Now it's one long island, basically, called the Rachel Carson Reserve. I mentioned Rachel Carson. She worked at the Duke Marine Lab. She wrote the book Silent Spring about the dangers of pesticide and coming down streams, rivers, and into the ocean. She worked here and lived here in town. That's the Rachel Carson Reserve. Oh, I told them to bring my boat in. I wish they had done it. I always get embarrassed. I want the flag up. Oh, darn it. Put it away. Sorry. Now, if you have good eyes, out in Rachel Carson Reserve, there are over 40 wild horses. And if you're very lucky today, you'll see some wild horses. I'll tell you how they got there. If you're very lucky, you'll see dolphins in Taylor's Creek. And if you see dolphins and horses, you have to charge them. Okay? I had my granddaughter 3 years ago front row here, and she saw both horses and dolphins at the same time. I said, oh, thank you. Coming up on your left is the old post office. They built that in the early 1800s, and they wanted to build it there, but a man, Dr. Duncan, had a house there. He was old and infirm. He was in bed, but they bought his house for $30,000. They said, okay, you have to move it off the corner. And so he hired a man with a mule, 3 logs, and a block and tackle. And that man moved the house off that corner to where it sits today. You'll see it on your left going up, behind this stone wall. That is the house that man and mule and grease logs moved from the corner. It wasn't as big then, but it's still a monument of a job. I'm hoping they gave that mule the day off after he was finished. 2 summers ago, there was a woman about halfway down the bus. She raised her hand and said, yes, she said, I'm the granddaughter of Dr. Duncan. Wow, I had a celebrity here, Dr. Duncan's granddaughter. And supposedly he woke up and yelled for his daughter, his own daughter at that time, said, honey, 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 the trees are moving. He said, Daddy, don't you remember? The house is moving. He goes, all right, went back to sleep. This is Marsh Street. It's not named for a family named Marsh. It's because all of this area, we'd be in water now. This is Marsh Street, named for the marshes that were here. We're coming up to a house with a turret on it. You don't see many houses with turrets in Beaufort. It's called Blair House. And here's the Blair House on your left. It's on the books here in Beaufort. In 1800, that house sold for 1 cow and 1 calf. Keith and Marshall and I have offered the current owner 50 cows for the house. We thought that was a pretty good deal. He hasn't even called us back. Can you believe that? This house in the corner on your left here, this is called the Graveyard at the Atlantic. Almost 2,000 ships have gone down off our coast. Well, the owner of this lot in the old days heard about a big sailing ship with a load of lumber half sunk out there off the coast. He went out there, got the lumber off the ship and parts of the ship and built that entire house from that shipwreck. Fences on either corner here, undulating pickets, up and down picket. That's called a Beaufort style fence. It wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep your animals in because there was a law in the book, early days of Beaufort. If an animal got out, your pig, chicken, goat, whatever, it was legal for your neighbor to grab it, kill it, and eat it, as long as they gave half the meat to the church to feed the poor. My little brother Doug lives in this house to the left, but he's out of town. He's up in Maine right now. But he's the one who trained me as a narrator, so you can always blame him if you're unhappy. Now we're turning right on Live Oak Street. Live Oak goes up north, one of the entrances into Beaufort. Years ago, they had a big wooden gate at the end of Live Oak. I don't know if it was to keep people in or out, but it was a huge gate.